I want to start this conversation with you, Anand, and some of your words as kind of a scene setting for where we want to take this. And I'd like to ask you to read this passage. This is from a keynote address that Anand gave at the Obama Summit last fall, which you can see online. The whole thing is there. And I'm just going to hand it over to you. It's through the quotes. So these two paragraphs.
Our societies have experienced the magic that occurs when pluralism flourishes and the marginalized assume their proper powers. But loss stalks those victories as millions revolt against change and supremacies resurface. The losses threaten the magic. We need to invent new systems, new economies, new ways of life to seize the magic while redressing the loss. That is change's burden today, and why change cannot wait. Despite this urgency, many of our most visible, celebrated attempts at change keep failing to alleviate the present inequalities and resentments. In my reporting, I found that real change escapes many change makers because powerful illusions guide their projects.
One more.
It's a repeat.
Ah, thank you. Okay. So,
I agree with everything this guy says.
This guy is really accurate. Okay. So Anand goes on to name 3 powerful illusions that this sort of social change project, like the social entrepreneurship sector, all of us who work in philanthropy and thought leadership, et cetera, are ascribing to. But I really want to lean into the first one, which is he sort of takes on this starfish delusion. Does everyone know the Starfish Parable? All right, well, give us a little of the Starfish Parable.
So the Starfish Parable, which seems like half of you know, is this story of 2 friends are walking on the beach, and they see thousands of beached starfish that, if kind of left undisturbed, would die. And one of the friends picks up a starfish and throws it valiantly back into the ocean. He works with the Gates Foundation. I'm just kidding. And the other friend says, what difference does it make? And the thrower says, it makes a difference to that one. And this story has become a very kind of important and inspiring story among many of the people who do the work of change.
I have to say it's also in a children's book. Has anyone read the Zen children's book series? It's like we're still inculcating kids with this story.
I wish I had read the Zen children's book.
You know the big panda bear? You guys have read this, right? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
But this story is very influential. When I became a fellow of the Aspen Institute as sort of some large mistake where they thought I was a young entrepreneurial leader, and they made us read this and reflect on how we can, and it seems great to throw the starfish back. And it kind of took me time to start parsing that story a little bit and understand what's going on in that story. And I started to realize that the friend who seems like a bit of a Grinch, being like, what difference does it make, is actually onto something very profound, which is that the act of throwing that one starfish can kind of purchase a premature sense of all is well,
right,
and can distract from questions about why are the starfish being beached, how do they get there, who's responsible, am I complicit? And there's a way in which those are just 2 very different theories of how you make change. And I think part of, and this is a longer conversation that we're all going to have, but part of why we're in the world we're now in, whether it's Donald Trump or the level of inequality we have or any of the other things that we're not happy about, has to do with, I think, this very narrowed, feel-good definition of change, throwing one starfish back and ignoring the thousands on the beach.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about, was there an aha moment for your book when you were like, I have to take on this framework that people are, obviously the Aspen Institute Fellowship was a key turning point. Anand gave this talk, which you can also see online, where he, in the middle of sort of the belly of the beast, took on the Aspen Institute in a very brave way. But was there another aha moment when you were like sitting in some setting and you were like, all right, I gotta write this book?
The Aspen Institute's a remarkable institution, and it drew me in to be a fellow. And there were many moments, but I think above all, the Aspen Institute, which mostly takes in for this Henry Crown Fellowship business leaders who want to move from what they call success to significance, and who want to kind of go from making a killing to like giving back and helping people. Now, I had never made a killing because I'm a writer, but they put in a few kind of people for entertainment in
Okay, I was
every
gonna ask, how did you get
in every
there?
cohort.
Okay.
No, there's always like one weird painter or
Okay.
someone like that, just to spice it up, and bring down the average financial statement.
Yeah.
And so I'm in this thing, and it's really lovely, and we bond, and it's an amazing group of people. I officiated one of my classmates' weddings. I also started flying on people's private jets, which, by the way, are like regular jets, but just smaller and better. And it was just this kind of dazzling little world, and I saw Tom Friedman swimming in his mother-in-law's swimming pool while Congresswoman Jane Harman stood above him talking to him in her heels. I was into this world, this is actually where it all happens.
Right.
Right?
This is the room where it happens.
And we were all brought there with this kind of idea of you're changing the world. You have a responsibility to make the world a better place. Everybody does a project to make things better. And everybody did do these projects, and I just started looking kind of more deeply, and I'm kind of angry in retrospect at myself for how long it took me to see it, but private jets can be disorienting. And you started to ask questions about why is Goldman Sachs sponsoring a lunch for us, showcasing women it has empowered through some little program called 10,000 Women, when Goldman Sachs paid a $500 or $600 million fine for what it did in the financial crisis, which presumably meant that a lot more women lost their homes as a result of what it did.
Right.
Right? And why are we part of helping it launder its reputation? Why are the Koch brothers? Why are we having conversations about making the world a better place in the Koch seminar building?
Right.
From people who want to literally make America not democratic? Why are we having conversations, with hedge fund people about how to do a little project in Bridgeport to help, 6 children of color go to a charter school, but not talking about why people in Greenwich at that hedge fund have a public school that is 4 times better funded than the public school in Bridgeport? What were we not talking about when we came to change the world, and how were we using our changing of the world to not talk about those things?
Right. And this gets at, I think, the crux for all of us in the audience is, one of the things I so appreciate is you're asking, they're not really beginner mind questions because they're complex questions, but you trusted yourself, you listened hard enough to yourself to ask the inconvenient questions, even in those settings with the distraction of the private jet. And this is the feel good versus real good, which I think I stole from my friend Abby Fallick in the audience here, is about privileging those kinds of questions over the emotional environment that's set up in some of these social worlds, right, where we're led to believe because you're here, you're a good person, and sort of stripping that away and I'm going to ask inconvenient questions and think about root causes and systemic dynamics, even if they're on some level sort of paralyzing to start thinking about, which I so admire about your book. Mia, I want to get you in here. I think of Mia as kind of like a jujitsu master at piercing privileged people's illusions about doing good.
Which they love.
Yeah.
They're so happy about it.
They pay you to do it. It's
They never sign up for the second jiu-jitsu class.
Exactly. Yeah. The second lesson is a little harsh, but the first one feels like, okay. But so Mia has this very amazing TED Talk that flips the script completely, arguing that people experiencing poverty aren't the problem, but the solution. And she talks about, actually, Anand's book and Mia's talk have all sorts of important parallels that I can draw between them. But talk to us, Mia, about how you see the mistaken framing around so many of these social problems.
Well, I will say that even in that talk that I did, that my subsequent talks have been a critique of myself, of focusing on people who experience economic injustice as opposed to really focusing on why they are experiencing economic injustice. And we tend to problematize the people who are experiencing a problem, right? The people who are experiencing some kind of oppression as opposed to the system that is creating the oppression. So I think about in the Bay Area where Courtney, Natalie, and I live, there are encampments of unhoused people everywhere, under overpasses, along streets, and we refer to this as like the problem of homelessness, right? I'm like, homeless people are not the problem. What that allows us to do is really focus on homeless people and, the idea of housing people, which is important, but it problematizes them as opposed to the problem of gentrification, which is what's causing this. So we're not talking about all of the, tech bros who are moving in and essentially taking over housing, raising the cost of living in the Bay Area. We're not talking about how do we actually address that issue. We're talking about how do we, create 20 sheds that will house, 40 people who live on the street right now, who used to live in homes, in Oakland, in San Francisco, in Berkeley, and now live on the street. So that framing that we do allows us to kind of ignore the people and institutions and organizations and systems that have caused the problem and problematize human beings, who then get kind of referenced in ways that are deeply dehumanizing.
Right. And to your, so part of your wisdom here is pull back from the people who you probably don't know. So it's easy to blame them because you never actually had a conversation with them about how they ended up experiencing homelessness. So back up. And then think about some of these systemic and root causes. And also think about some of those folks who are experiencing that as the wisest ones about how do we actually fix some of these problems, right?
And I think, too, it allows, and Anand talks about this a lot in his book, it allows the people who are running massive tech companies, for example, or the kind of adjacent industries, it allows them to do things like, throw $1 million at a nonprofit organization and to solve the problem of homelessness, as opposed to addressing the fact that they are, there's this influx of human beings who have more money who they're bringing into the city who are displacing those people.
Right.
So it's not, yeah.
Okay. And so Natalie thinks a lot about these kind of economic dynamics, especially right now as the head of the Economic Security Project, which is looking at how could universal basic income potentially play a role in some of these systemic issues that we're talking about. So Natalie, you weigh in here. What do you think about sort of the public-private? Because I think when we start talking about systemic, with the systemic lens, I think, and probably I'm guessing some of you in the audience feel immediately fuck, how do we actually make change at that depth of level? It's one thing to fund nonprofit organizations who are doing their piece. It's one thing to work in the public sector, try to change policy, but to try to actually get these sectors working together for full-scale systemic change feels very daunting in our current economic landscape. So will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm going to further the daunt a little bit.
Yeah.
No, I'm really interested in the places where people who are doing interesting things rub up against the thing I'm most worried about, which is power, and specifically the power to craft a 21st century social contract. Markets didn't give us the 8-hour workday. Markets didn't give us minimum wage. Markets didn't give us the weekend or ensure that children don't work in factories. It was social movements that pushed for that. It was blood and bullets. It was a very bloody time in American history as we were moving out of the farms and into the factories and crafted the new rules of work. And they're the way we work today. We think of them as the norms of work. And underneath our feet, work is shifting yet again. Most new jobs added are contingent work. They're seasonal, they're temporary, or they're low paid in restaurant industry and the service industry that have very little benefits anyway. And so here we are needing to craft a new social contract, and power still is one of the most important questions. There's a couple places that do give me hope. In Washington State, a labor union and some gig economy companies are working to create benefits and protections that would apply to anyone across, no matter how they work, whether you are an Uber driver or whether you are a full-time employee. It would be portable, meaning you move with it from job to job. You keep your paid time off, your sick leave. It's prorated, so if you do 10 hours of work here or 20 hours of work here as an independent contractor, it adds up. And it's universal, meaning no matter how you work, it applies to you. So that's an example of a place where they're starting to forge the 21st century social contract. I also think of Stockton, California, where Mayor Michael Tubbs, the 28-year-old mayor of Stockton, California, the first big city in America to declare bankruptcy before Detroit, now run by this new mayor. He's leading the nation's first city-led demonstration of a guaranteed income, which means that a handful of Stocktonians will receive monthly income with no strings attached. I think of this as forging the next social contract. But fundamentally, it all comes down to power. And 100 years ago, when we wrote the rules of work, we had an active labor movement, and now we have a very declining labor movement. And it's not clear to me what will emerge as the worker voice and the sources of power that will sort of be the checks and balances, to push that forward. When 0.1% own 90% of the wealth, which is 1929 levels, there's a major power imbalance. And so I think there are signals of where it's happening and what it could look like, but there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I feel like both of you might have things you want to jump in. I saw the jump in faces. Do you want to?
I mean, I think this is a little bit of why all of us kind of wrestle with institutions of power, right? It is, I know that if I feel like I have access to some of those rooms, then I have an obligation to kind of, figure out how to navigate that space.
Right. Well, and I wanted to put us all of our feet to the fire a little bit. As you mentioned, you have basked in the sunlight of the Aspen Institute campus, as have all of us on the stage. TED, like a lot of these powerful institutions that we have played roles in. And when I get in major existential knots about all of this, as anyone who knows me knows I do, I think of that, if I don't use this power in some way, then that's also not good. So if I have access to these institutions, how do I use that power? And how do I be a bridge builder and a connector? But then there are other times when I think I'm just playing into this whole system and the whole narrative around where change happens and where it doesn't. So how do you three personally wrestle with how you spend your energy, who you accept your money from, how you know that you are part of the solution rather than just a part of the machine that you're critiquing?
I think a lot about it. I think it's very hard to, in any age, fully exist outside of whatever the power structure of that age is.
Right.
I think you can, at the margin, make choices to do this and not this and this and not that, and to the extent that I can, I do those. But I also think, and there's different people with different attitudes, that you have to do some combination. My basic thesis here is that we have to kind of change where we go to change the world.
Right.
And we have to go back to changing it democratically the way we did all those things you talked about. And I actually think that is a two-pronged effort. I think it involves some voluntary awakening within the people who are falsely claiming to change it right now. All of them are not going to come along, but there's a surprisingly high number of people within those spaces who secretly agree, and when you give them a book or a talk that puts those things into words, they kind of have their, yes, I feel the same moment, and can sort of work to dismantle those narratives, at least, within those spaces. And then you got to kind of take your case to the public and say, stop trusting these people to change the world. And I just want to say one more thing based on this work day and all that stuff, because it's so important. And something you said about it feels so overwhelming to make systemic change. I want to push back against this idea. I actually think that idea is just dead wrong. And I think that idea is actually some of the kind of founding bullshit pushed by plutocrats. Okay?
That systems change is not as hard as we
I'm sorry, passing a law to make the workday 8 hours is actually something you can do a lot faster and more efficiently than a lot of philanthropic programs here in the United States.
Do you agree with that, Natalie?
We could pass it tomorrow if we could get the votes, right? And then it's just the law.
Well, I don't think it's easy, but I think you have a very high ROI on your investment to invest in social movements and policy change versus investing in other things that sort of put a Band-Aid on the problem.
Think about, let's take the issue of empowering women, which everybody claims they're for. Think about how many private...
I'm kind of for it, yeah.
Think about how many private initiatives there are. Lean in, do this, learn to code. I mean, thousands of things, each with their own board of directors, this and that. Right? What are we not talking about in America? Universal daycare. Right? Which in every European country, when you do that, it just makes it a lot easier for millions of women to actually go to work in the way that we're claiming we favor. Right?
So if it's
I actually think it'd be a lot easier to aim for a law like that, one law, one focus, and actually have it apply to everybody, than divide our country into 8,000 little pieces and have 50,000 groups. I just want to, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's not, the idea that it's harder, to me, is false.
Well, I agree too, because you're creating the rules, the new rules by which people play, versus setting up a system where you then have to entice everyone to voluntarily use their corporate social responsibility money to do these set of things. If we just create the new rules, then business can calibrate accordingly. But, you know, it all comes down to who pays for it. It all comes down to capital.
But in the case of like universal daycare, part of what you would have to do is get a very intersectional, like broad-based feminist movement to say this is something that we are going to put a bunch of energy and focus on. I mean, Mia, don't you think it's hard to get that many people coordinated and messaged around something when the deep value of the movement is its broad base? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. But I also think that, I mean, I appreciate you pushing back on that, because I think there's this way in which we all kind of we are given rhetoric about how hard change is, right? But we also tend to focus it on like a national scale, right? We could have, you know, Oakland could pass universal daycare, right? The UBI experiment that's happening in Stockton, like they're doing it in Stockton. We're not saying let's create guaranteed income for the entire nation tomorrow.
Right.
We're saying let's start in this one place and see what that looks like, and that's how you get those things to happen. I mean, if you look at gay marriage, right? Those were state strategies. That was not. I mean, it was a national strategy ultimately, but it was a national strategy that was started in locations.
Right.
And I think part of why we think of change as being so overwhelming is that we're often looking at a global or a national picture as opposed to the shit that's actually happening in our own communities.
This is such an interesting point, right? Well, and this is also a piece of the world that you call market world in the new book, which is a very global mentality. It's like people aren't really from a place. It's like they have multiple homes in multiple places, and they have their global mindset, so that there isn't that sense of rootedness and starting with change in the place where your feet are planted.
And I think for a lot of kind of industry right now, and I'm focusing on the tech industry, but I know that there are adjacent industries that do the same thing. They're doing things to create like home and family inside of a workplace, as opposed to expecting that people are going to do that like with their neighbors. And I think that is part of why we're seeing this kind of deep disconnection between the human beings who work in those places and the actual communities that they live in, because their community ends up being their coworkers.
Right.
And like your coworkers are not your family.
Right.
Like you're not a big family in your organization, because if you stop doing whatever the thing is that you're being paid for well, or the industry changes and they're gonna fire you.
Right.
Right? They're not gonna keep you. Whereas like your family, I mean, sometimes your family fires you, but like for better for worse, like
Always for cause.
You can stay in your chosen or biological or legal family. Like you stay in that. Like people show up for each other in this way that they do not in your workplace. And I don't want to let us off the hook from your original question, which is like, how do we wrestle with kind of having access to these rooms of power and the seductiveness of it, which is how I think about it, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like, it is a kind of constant tension for me when I think about being in those spaces and like what my role is there. And like, yes, I haven't been on any private jets yet, but there's a lot that I get from those things materially and in terms of credibility or accolades or whatever that feel good, right? And I think that, again, part of it for me is staying grounded in the like reality of the community that I live in, so that I am not, that I'm being held accountable by a group of people who don't have access to those rooms. And I know that if I go back to them and have not done anything for them, right, I've like, allowed the like fanciness to seduce me, then like they're gonna hold me accountable, and I know I'm gonna feel way worse like going back than I am making a wealthy white person uncomfortable because I'm calling them out on their stuff while I'm in their space.
That's really. Will they hold you accountable? Actually,
the people who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, they will hold me accountable in that I'll feel like shit,
Okay.
And like, and I have to like, you know, they're people who I see on a regular basis, right?
Right.
And I'll feel bad. It will be really, really uncomfortable to me at home
Right.
if I'm not doing my job in those
Your
rooms.
own internal
Right.
experience of returning into that
Yes.
indicates to you, okay, red light, like that was not a contributive experience where I actually use my energy.
Exactly. And I feel like I've been really explicit with those folks that they are meant to hold me accountable.
And I think,
Very
too,
powerful.
the way you hold yourself in those rooms is very different if you are holding your accountability communities in your heart and head when you speak. Because it's often easy to say the safe things and talk in nuance around the harder subjects, frankly, of power in those rooms. But I think you're forced to push the boundaries if you do that. And I don't always do it well, but that's the way I think about it. So I'd offer a hack to an amendment to the Starfish hack, which would be, it is very important to work on systems change and to question why the starfish are on the beach, but I think you have to hold a starfish with you to sort of remember why, because you can get very wrapped up in if you work on national issues or big systems change, you can get wrapped up in the policy and the data and forget the people. And so over the course of my 20 years of doing social change work, I've been very focused on the systems change and have found recently it's very important to actually keep that piece, the starfish piece too.
I love that. That's a great amendment. So I'm going to borrow a question from my mentor, and many of you know Krista Tippett, which is, I want to hear something that gives you despair right now and something that gives you hope.
Oh God, I mean.
It's okay, the hope can also be a despair.
Many times they're linked. Many times they're linked.
I mean, some folks who know me know that I'm all about being apocalypse ready.
It's true. This woman is who you want with you when the apocalypse
I try to maintain.
I think it's here.
Yeah, it's right now. We're experiencing
I try to maintain a set of skills that I think will be important for like actual. I'm not kidding. Like for actual survival, I have a bow and arrow. I am a beekeeper. Like for real. And I think that there is when I think about, you know, whether it's the, you know, rise of the Nazis or environmental disaster, whether, you know, rising sea levels, or, you know, like we've overused antibiotics, so we're going to have like a huge die-off because of some disease, right? Like, yes, the apocalypse is here, but like more is coming. Is going to get worse, and I'm clear about that. And that is, I mean, I'm tearing up a little behind my makeup here and trying not to make my mascara run. Feels very devastating to me. And at the same time, I'm like, that is an opportunity for us to like create the society we actually want. I feel like burning everything down, whether it's us doing it or, you know, Mother Nature being like, I'm sick of all of y'all. Let like a small percentage of you live. That rebuilding, whoever is left, like being able to rebuild and like be like, you know what, we know all the shit that did not work for us. Like, let's do something else.
And this is reminding me of Adrienne Marie Brown's beautiful work around speculative fiction. Do you guys know Adrienne? She works with community organizers to imagine and write basically science fiction of the world she wants to create. So in this moment of despair, there is this, out of the desperation, the sense of creativity and like an urgency. Like we are not sitting back on our haunches in the private jets thinking like this is normal.
And I think part of our job right now is to do our like personal work to unpack all of our internalized racism and sexism and kind of beliefs around scarcity, so that when we have the opportunity to build something new, we're not bringing all that shit with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Natalie?
One of the things despairing to me right now is the retail apocalypse that we're living through, where there are literally thousands of retail stores closing down and people without a job overnight. So Toys R Us was the most recent one. Overnight, 32,000 employees out of business. And it's not automation or robots or even Amazon, it's Wall Street greed. Private equity went in, bought the chain. Turns out retail wasn't actually as good of a bet, so they just closed the stores. And they actually have bought dozens of chains like that are probably going to all be out of business in the next few years. So it's going to get worse. But one of the things that gives me hope is the Toys R Us employees are actually fighting back. So there were 32,000 of them out of job overnight, no severance, nothing. Many of them who'd worked for the chain for a very long time, while the Wall Street owners walked away with $400 million from the debacle and a serious severance. So there's about 16,000 Toys R Us employees who have formed a Facebook group called the Society of the Dead Giraffe. And they have come together with...
I have not heard this.
Yes, with a new campaign called Retail Rising. And just a few days ago, they went in and occupied a store. They're asking for severance. And they're doing this together. They're using social media. They went in with Senator Booker, who's demanding to know, why this happened. And why this matters is because there will be a lot more retail jobs lost, and it's important it doesn't just end and evaporate, but that there's a political cost for this sort of greed on Wall Street. And so I'm really hopeful with what the Toys R Us employees who are out of a job right now may do.
That's amazing. Anand, can you wrap us up with some despair and joy?
I always have.
I know you do
a little bit
despair
of
well.
both. Yeah, I do both well.
Okay, good.
One in private.
Okay.
I actually despair at the fact that our problem is 10 times deeper than Donald Trump, and Donald Trump may distract us from that reality. He is the symptom, not the disease. The disease has been eating at us for a very long time. You don't get a Donald Trump without 10 parallel system failures all happening at the same time. He has 100 lightning strikes in the same spot in the same hour.
And narrative failures, right? I feel like
Yes,
that's
institutions, narratives, everything. I called my book Winners Take All, literally because I think the winners are taking all, are stealing the future. And we have Donald Trump as president, but also a raft of other problems, because when the winners monopolize the future, people start to get angry, understandably, and start to drop out of the kind of lives that you want people to be living in a free society. But here's the hope. I actually think we are not days, not weeks, but a matter of years away from an age of reform, a true age of reform, the kind of age that gave us the things you're talking about. Whenever I despair, my antidote is to kind of think on a historical scale as opposed to a news cycle scale. And I think we are at the end of a cycle. I think we're at the end of a 100-year cycle. That 100-year cycle started with a bunch of reforms that happened because they were having problems with all the new things they had created and all the new realities they hadn't dealt with, and they created all that new stuff that you so beautifully listed. And now I think we're dealing with the friction in the system from our realities having far outstripped our institutions and our narratives. And I think we actually have no choice but to create a new age of reform and institutions that actually work for people, and stories and ideas about work and ideas about inclusion and belonging. And I think we have really bottomed out. And part of bottoming out means you're going up.
Well, I am grateful to know you three in the apocalypse that we are experiencing and the resurgence where we're headed. Thank you for your wisdom today and always.
Thank you.